Margaret Lane had always been a woman who knew how to make things work. At 67 years old, she lived a life many dreamed of, comfortable, peaceful, and financially secure. Her two-story colonial-style house sat on the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac in Charleston, South Carolina, shaded by old oaks and lined with blooming azaleas. To neighbors, Margaret seemed like the embodiment of success after retirement. She had spent over 3 decades building her wealth through real estate, starting from small rentals and eventually owning entire apartment complexes. When she finally retired, she wasn't just living comfortably, she was living smart. Her husband, Douglas Lane, was 52. He was tall, well-groomed, and always had a smile for the neighbors. Margaret had met him at a gym she'd joined after her first husband died of a heart attack. Douglas had been a personal trainer, charming and attentive. He had a way of making Margaret feel young again. The age gap raised some eyebrows, but Margaret had brushed it off. She liked being with someone who brought energy into her life, and Douglas at the time seemed like a breath of fresh air. They got married after a year of dating. Douglas left his job soon after and moved into her home. He told friends he was taking a break from work to focus on building a life with Margaret. But that break became permanent. Over the years, he didn't return to the workforce. Instead, he took on the role of house manager, a title he gave himself. He claimed he handled all the bills, landscaping appointments, and upkeep, though in reality, Margaret continued managing everything. She never complained publicly. She was used to doing things herself. Still, people noticed things. Douglas was often seen around town during the day, shopping, going to bars, or sitting alone at coffee shops. He didn't seem busy. And though he always spoke fondly of Margaret, there was a distance between them that didn't go unnoticed. At neighborhood gatherings, Margaret would come alone more often. She explained Douglas wasn't feeling well, or that he had errands to run. But when he did appear, there was something cold about how he acted around her, smiling when others were looking, quiet when they weren't. Behind the closed doors of their home, Margaret began to feel the weight of that distance too. She wasn't naive. In her youth, she had seen how money changed people, and she had always been careful with who she trusted. For years, she had managed her assets on her own, keeping track of property records, bank accounts, and her life insurance policy, which was valued at $1.7 million. It had been set up after her first husband's death, with the intention of helping any future spouse or relatives with expenses. But with no children and very little family left, Douglas had become the sole beneficiary by default. Margaret had noticed small things at first, missing receipts, new items Douglas bought without telling her, and large cash withdrawals from their shared accounts. Once, she discovered a valuable ring she had inherited was gone. Douglas said he thought she had misplaced it, but something about his tone made her stomach twist. She didn't argue. She just nodded and went silent, retreating into her thoughts. Instead of confronting him, she began documenting. It was a habit she had developed during her real estate years. Everything was backed up, every conversation written down, every expense tracked. She began keeping a separate notebook, one she hid in her home office. She recorded every strange occurrence, every odd transaction, every time Douglas disappeared without an explanation. And she began revisiting her financial documents, particularly the life insurance policy. The more she looked at it, the more uncomfortable she became. Douglas's behavior shifted too. He had started making offhand comments, jokes about her. Getting older, about what if something happened. He talked more about travel, saying he couldn't wait to finally have freedom. Once, He mentioned a beach house in the Keys, somewhere they had never visited together. When Margaret asked how he'd pay for it, he laughed and said, "Don't worry about it. These weren't red flags, they were sirens." Margaret knew she couldn't ignore them, but she also knew that if Douglas was planning something, reacting too quickly could be dangerous. Instead, she began building a quiet safety net. She visited her lawyer in secret and made subtle changes to her will, including a clause that allowed for an automatic fraud investigation if she died under unusual circumstances. She also gave the lawyer a sealed envelope with instructions to only open it upon her death. That envelope included names, dates, financial statements, and her suspicions. At the same time, she visited her bank and arranged for a safe deposit box. Inside, she placed a letter detailing everything she had observed and a USB drive with recordings from the hidden security cameras she was about to install. The cameras were discreet, placed in her bedroom, kitchen, and living room. She paid in cash and set them up when Douglas was out one afternoon. She kept living as if everything was normal. She went on morning walks, had coffee with her neighbors, and even went out for dinner with Douglas once or twice a week. But her eyes never stopped watching. Her ears never stopped listening. She didn't sleep as easily anymore. Every time Douglas brought her tea, she pretended to sip it and poured it down the sink when he wasn't looking. Her world had become a silent battlefield, and she was preparing for the worst. Then something happened that changed the tempo. Douglas began asking about the policy directly. He wanted to know if she had updated her documents, if the beneficiaries were still the same. He brought it up casually, acting concerned about the future, but Margaret could hear the hunger in his voice. It was then she realized, if she didn't act fast, the worst could happen sooner than she thought. But she wasn't ready to run. She had one goal now, to make sure that if he did go through with anything, he wouldn't get away with it. She was playing the long game, and every move she made from that point forward was done with one purpose in mind: to protect her, truth, and trap him with it. Margaret's days became quieter, but her mind never rested. Every sound in the house, every shift in Douglas's behavior, only added to the weight pressing down on her chest. She had lived alone for many years before marrying again. Silence had once been her peace, but now it felt like a warning. Something wasn't right, and no matter how much she wanted to ignore the feeling, she couldn't. Douglas's movements became more calculated. He spent more time in his home office, door locked, phone pressed tightly to his ear whenever Margaret walked by. Sometimes she caught bits and pieces of his conversations, half sentences, muffled by the door, words like "done soon," "keep quiet," or "clean break." It wasn't enough to accuse him of anything, but it was enough to convince her that she was not just imagining things. He had also started staying out later. He used to be home most evenings, watching TV or working out in the garage. Now he claimed he was helping a friend fix up a house across town or attending some late-night fitness class, but he never came home sweaty. He never brought home tools. When Margaret casually asked for the name of the friend or the gym, Douglas would change the subject or respond vaguely, saying things like, "Just someone from the old days." Margaret knew how liars worked. In her career, she had dealt with more than a few. The key was always consistency. Douglas had none. Every story he gave her had a different timeline, different details. Once, he told her he had been stuck in traffic for over an hour, but the GPS in his car showed a trip that took just 18 minutes. She didn't confront him. Instead, she wrote it down in her notebook, time-stamped and filed, The more she observed, the more obvious it became that Douglas was hiding something big. He had started paying unusually close attention to her daily routines. What time she woke up, what pills she took, how long she spent in the shower. He even once offered to help her prepare her tea in the morning, a task he had never shown interest in before. That moment stood out like a red flag. She took the tea with a polite smile, thanked him, and quietly poured it down the bathroom drain. At the same time, her efforts to protect herself deepened. Margaret began backing up everything on encrypted USB drives. Financial statements, emails, phone logs, even pictures of every room in the house. She knew Douglas had access to her computers, so she bought a second laptop and hid it in her closet under a box of old scarves. It was the same laptop she used to document the camera footage. Every night, after Douglas went to sleep, she downloaded the clips from the hidden devices. She didn't know if he'd ever see them, but if something happened to her, the police would. Her visits to the lawyer also increased. They had now become more than just check-ins. She was building a legal case without saying it out loud. She had asked her lawyer to include special instructions in her will, a requirement that no death benefit could be released without a full medical review and a separate criminal investigation if she died from an accident, overdose, or any injury. It was an unusual clause, but her long-standing reputation as a serious and cautious investor made it acceptable to the insurance company. They filed it away, assuming it was just another quirk from a wealthy client. Margaret once overheard a phone call late at night. Douglas was in the kitchen, thinking she was asleep. His voice was low, but firm. He told someone that everything was almost ready, and that he just needed to be patient a little longer. She couldn't hear the response, but she heard Douglas chuckle. It wasn't the kind of laugh that came from joy. It was dark, mean, final. She added the recording from that night to her growing archive. Every piece mattered. Every second captured could be the one that proved her instincts were right. Margaret no longer doubted what was happening. The only question left was when. In her heart, she hoped Douglas would change course, that he'd realize she wasn't easy to fool, that he'd stop whatever plan he had. But in her mind, she had already accepted the possibility that she might not be able to stop him. So instead, she made it her mission to make sure he didn't get away with it. Margaret didn't know exactly how or when it would unfold. But she had prepared everything: documents, footage, instructions, passwords, and warnings. If he made a move, the world would know the truth, even if she wouldn't be around to tell it. The summer of that year was unusually warm in Charleston. The air was thick, and the heat clung to everything like a warning. Margaret moved slower, not just because of the weather, but because the tension in her home had grown unbearable. Every room felt like a trap. Douglas had changed. He wasn't just secretive anymore. He was watchful, observant, too calm. It was the kind of calm that comes before something breaks. She noticed how often he hovered near her when she handled her medications, how he stood closer when she cooked, how his eyes followed her hands. Once he asked if she needed help with her prescriptions. She declined with a forced smile, sensing the danger in the offer. A few nights later, she secretly counted her pills and found that 2 were missing. She hadn't taken them. No one else could have. That was the moment she realized the game was almost over. Margaret's instincts had rarely failed her. In her business days, she had walked away from deals moments before they collapsed. She could read people. And now, everything in Douglas's body language told her he had made up his mind. She didn't know the date or method, but she knew his patience had run out. He had begun acting more affectionate, which unsettled her even more. He cooked dinner, lit candles, and played old jazz music during meals, things he hadn't done in years. He even brought her flowers one afternoon, lilies from a grocery store down the road. But there was nothing warm in his eyes when he handed them to her. It was rehearsed, a final act. Margaret smiled, thanked him, and placed them in a vase she knew she would throw away after he left the room. What Douglas didn't know was that Margaret had already put her final defense in motion. She mailed a package to her lawyer containing 2 USB drives and a copy of the updated insurance policy with the fraud clause highlighted. She also included a letter stating clearly that if she died suddenly, Douglas Lane should be the first and only suspect. The letter was blunt, with no emotional flourishes, just facts, timelines, and evidence. She made sure her handwriting was steady. She signed it twice. She had also scheduled a final update to her will, which she planned to complete the following week. But she feared she might not have that much time. Each night, she locked her bedroom door, not for safety, but for peace of mind. It didn't stop her fear, but it gave her a few more seconds to think if something went wrong. Then came the night it almost did. It started like a regular evening. Douglas made dinner, chicken with a light sauce and mashed potatoes. He poured them both a glass of wine. Margaret took small sips and pretended to eat most of the food, then later flushed it down the toilet when Douglas stepped outside to take a call. Something about the taste felt off, slightly bitter under the sauce. Her stomach churned, not from the food, but from the fear that tonight might be the night. After dinner, she excused herself early and went to bed. She locked the door, checked the hidden cameras, and sat in silence. Her heart was racing. Around midnight, she heard footsteps outside her room. Slow, deliberate. Then a pause. The doorknob jiggled, not aggressively, but just enough to check. She held her breath. A few moments passed and the steps moved away. She didn't sleep after that. In the morning, she acted normal. She smiled, talked about the weather, and even complimented his cooking. Inside, she was unraveling. She called her lawyer from the car while pretending to run errands. She asked if the package had arrived. It had. Her lawyer confirmed it was in a secure file, and the contents were noted. Margaret felt a strange kind of relief, knowing that if anything happened, her voice would not be silenced. But Douglas wasn't slowing down. That week, she found traces of something powdery on the counter near the coffee pot. She didn't drink it. She threw it out and cleaned every surface. Her notebook entries had grown darker. No longer just observations, they were now warnings, written as if she were speaking to someone who would read them after her death. She started preparing her home for the worst. She placed a copy of her most important documents in a sealed envelope under the floorboard in her office closet. She texted her lawyer one final time, a short message with the phrase they had agreed on months ago. Umbrellas open. It meant she believed danger was imminent. The next night, she pretended to fall asleep early. Douglas came to check on her twice. Each time she kept her breathing steady, her body still. At 3 a.m. he entered the room. She heard him as clearly as if her eyes were open. He moved silently toward her side of the bed. For a moment, she thought he would strike her there. But he just stood still. Then he left. The next morning, she decided it was time to take her final step. Margaret drove to a private investigator she had hired weeks ago under a fake name. He was a retired cop with a history of surveillance work. She gave him everything: copies of the camera footage, the medication bottles, and details about the suspicious meals and missing pills. She asked him to keep it locked and only contact the police if he didn't hear from her within 5 days. He agreed without asking many questions. He had seen worse. When she returned home that afternoon, Douglas was waiting. He smiled as if nothing had happened and asked about her day. She said she went shopping. He made lunch. This time, she didn't eat at all. She pretended to have a headache and went to lie down. That evening, Douglas suggested they take a trip together. "Just the two of us," he said. "Get away for a while." Margaret nodded. She said it sounded lovely. He didn't know she had already printed out the camera footage and given her neighbor a sealed envelope marked, "Delivered to police if anything happens to me." As night fell, she stood at her window and looked out at the quiet street. The trees swayed in the wind, and the moon cast long shadows across her lawn. Somewhere in the house, Douglas was waiting, watching, preparing. But he wasn't the only one. Margaret had turned her home into a silent witness. Every room knew the truth. Every camera remembered. And now, it was only a matter of time before someone else would know too. The morning began like all the others, but Margaret felt it in her bones. This was the day. The air inside the house felt too still, too controlled. Even the usual creaks of the old floorboards seemed to have gone quiet, like the house itself was holding its breath. Douglas moved with unusual energy, whistling while making breakfast, humming an old song Margaret couldn't recognize. It was out of place. He had never been a morning person, never so cheerful. That sudden cheerfulness was not comfort, it was confirmation. He brought her breakfast in bed: eggs, toast, and fresh squeezed orange juice. She stared at the tray a moment longer than she should have, her mind racing through all the possibilities. He urged her to eat while it was still hot. She smiled, said thank you, and claimed she would eat after a shower. As he left the room, she carefully placed the meal on the dresser and slid the juice into a small plastic bag she had hidden beneath the mattress. Later, she would give it to the investigator for testing. Margaret had lived long enough to know that death doesn't always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it wears a friendly face and offers breakfast in bed. She didn't want to die. That fear was real and overwhelming. But more than fear, she felt clarity. She had done all she could. Now it was time to face whatever came next, whether it was justice or something far worse. Douglas left the house shortly after, saying he needed to pick up something from the store. She used the opportunity to visit her hidden laptop. She uploaded the most recent camera footage to a secure cloud account, double-checked her list of evidence, and made one final recording. In it, she spoke directly to the camera, calmly and clearly, explaining her suspicions, the strange behavior, and the steps she had taken to protect herself. She ended it by saying, "If you're watching this, then it means I was right." She emailed the video to her lawyer and the private investigator. Then she changed clothes and sat on the front porch watching the street. She wasn't sure what Douglas was doing or when he'd return, but she knew it would be soon. There was a heaviness in her chest that told her time was nearly up. Around noon, he came back carrying a single small bag. He said it was some vitamins. He thought she needed something to help with sleep and energy. Margaret knew they were neither. She thanked him and placed the bag on the counter. He seemed irritated she didn't open it. His smile had a sharpness now, like a blade held behind the lips. The day passed slowly, Douglas kept glancing at the clock, pacing the house, checking his phone. Margaret could sense he was waiting for the right moment. Around dusk, he suggested they watch a movie together. She agreed, sitting beside him on the couch, heart thudding in her chest. He poured her another drink, wine this time. She didn't touch it. Halfway through the film, he excused himself to the kitchen. Moments later, she heard the unmistakable sound of pills being crushed. The faint clink of a spoon against glass. She didn't react. When he returned with a new drink, she took it, held it for a few minutes, then said she needed to use the bathroom. She flushed the contents and returned with the empty glass, pretending to be sleepy. Douglas's eyes lit up just slightly. He offered to help her to bed. She agreed. In the bedroom, she lay under the covers, fully clothed beneath the blanket. She closed her eyes but didn't sleep. She listened. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Then the door creaked open again. Soft steps, the sound of something being placed on her nightstand. A quiet whisper. He was talking to himself. Then silence. When she opened her eyes an hour later, she was alone. The night had gone quiet again. In the morning, Douglas found her already awake and seated in the kitchen. She smiled, calm and collected. He asked if she slept well. She said yes. She told him the vitamins he gave her had helped. That comment seemed to relax him, but she knew he'd try again. What she didn't know was that her package to the lawyer had triggered more than she expected. Her private investigator had opened the emergency file and, seeing the most recent evidence, contacted law enforcement. A detective quietly opened an inquiry into Douglas Lane. Background checks revealed more than Margaret had found. Financial records showed Douglas had been making quiet inquiries into offshore accounts. He had reached out to an old contact in Costa Rica. He had asked about buying property in cash. The timeline matched the changes in his behavior that Margaret had noted. The local police didn't act immediately, but they began watching the house. An unmarked car passed by the next morning. A second officer posed as a delivery driver, snapping photos from across the street. Douglas didn't notice. Inside the home, Margaret played her role perfectly. She let him believe she was trusting, vulnerable, unaware. Each evening she documented her physical state, noted every food item, every unusual smell, and every suspicious interaction. She also wrote a second letter to the police, unsigned, undated, describing the events of the last 2 weeks, with an instruction to open it only if her body was found under unclear circumstances. Douglas made his final move the following evening. He suggested they take a drive to the lake house, one Margaret hadn't visited in years. It was secluded, surrounded by woods. Perfect, he said, for relaxing. He packed a cooler, some blankets, and a bottle of wine. Margaret said it sounded lovely. She called the private investigator just before they left. She said one word: waterfall. It was the code they had agreed on for emergencies. He didn't respond. He just got in his car and drove. As they left the city and moved onto back roads, Margaret kept her breathing steady. Douglas chatted about nothing: weather, gas prices, a friend's new truck. It was all background noise. Her mind was focused on the seatbelt buckle in her hand, the phone hidden in her coat pocket, and the hope that someone, somewhere, was watching. They reached the lake house just after sunset. The sky was deep orange, and the trees cast long shadows on the cabin walls. Douglas unloaded the cooler and blanket and asked her to walk with him down the trail. She hesitated just a second too long. He noticed. His smile faded. Then headlights appeared behind them. Another car pulled up. Douglas turned sharply, startled. The private investigator stepped out first, followed by a uniformed officer. Douglas didn't move. Margaret stepped away from him and said nothing. The officer walked up calmly and announced they were conducting a welfare check. Douglas tried to protest, but it was too late. Margaret opened her bag and handed them everything. USB, drives, photos, letters. The investigator added his own files to the pile. Douglas was arrested on the spot. No struggle, no words. Back in the city, detectives began putting the case together. Forensics confirmed the presence of sedatives in multiple food samples Margaret had saved. The pills Douglas had crushed matched medications not prescribed to anyone in the household. The offshore inquiries, the life insurance adjustments, and the camera footage formed an airtight case. Margaret had done it. She had stayed alive just long enough. The courtroom was packed, not with curious strangers, but with quiet observers, journalists, law enforcement, and members of the community who knew Margaret Lane as the elegant widow who used to host charity dinners and raise funds for local art programs. Now she was the reason everyone's eyes were fixed on a man who had once been her husband. Tutuklan. Lane sat silently at the defendant's table, wearing a suit too clean for the crimes he was accused of. He didn't look at Margaret, not even once. The trial began quickly. Prosecutors wasted no time presenting the facts. The altered life insurance policy worth $1.7 million. The crushed sedatives found in food and drink samples from the Lane household, and the financial records showing Douglas had made arrangements to move funds overseas. The story was clear to the jury. Douglas hadn't just planned to kill his wife. He had designed every detail to make it look natural. But he had underestimated the woman he was married to. Margaret did not testify in a dramatic way. Her presence alone commanded attention. She took the stand and calmly explained the pattern of behavior that raised alarms. Missing pills, bitter-tasting food, strange middle-of-the-night movements, and sudden false affection. Her voice never trembled. She told the court about the secret recordings, the safety codes she had with her lawyer and investigator, and the packages she had mailed days before her husband's final attempt. She wasn't trying to win sympathy. She was making it clear that she had known her life was at risk and had done everything possible to survive. The defense struggled to counter the evidence. Douglas's lawyer argued that Margaret had become paranoid with age and misinterpreted her husband's actions. They said there was no physical evidence that he ever intended harm, just circumstantial clues and assumptions. But when the lab results from the wine glass were introduced, confirming a high concentration of a sedative used in assisted suicide cases, the defense's arguments fell apart. There was no medical explanation for why Douglas had possession of those drugs, nor why he had crushed and slipped them into food that only Margaret was served. Still, what sealed Douglas Lane's fate was not a single piece of evidence, but the pattern of deceit. He had carefully emptied accounts, transferred assets, and even forged Margaret's signature on 2 financial documents. His online history showed research into poisons, legal loopholes in life insurance policies, and how long certain drugs took to leave the system. The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. Douglas showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder, insurance fraud, unlawful possession of controlled substances, and conspiracy to commit murder. He looked down, not in shame, but in disbelief. He had, lost. Margaret didn't cry. She nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement that the final piece of her plan had fallen into place. She hadn't just escaped a murder attempt. She had built the entire case that would put her would-be killer behind bars. In the weeks that followed, the story spread beyond Charleston. News outlets called her the widow who outsmarted death. Some praised her bravery, others called her lucky. But those who truly knew Margaret understood it was neither bravery nor luck. It was preparation. She had spent months gathering evidence, trusting no one, documenting everything. She didn't act out of vengeance. She acted out of survival. The private investigator, a man who had initially thought this would be a routine domestic case, told reporters it was the most calculated murder attempt he had ever seen, and the most brilliant defense he'd witnessed from a victim. She laid traps within traps, he said. Every time he tried to move, she was one step ahead. Douglas was sentenced to 35 years in prison. He would be eligible for parole in 20, but given the public nature of the trial and the overwhelming evidence, even his lawyer admitted parole was unlikely. He never showed remorse, never apologized. In his mind, he had been wronged. The money, the home, the life he thought he deserved had slipped through his fingers because the woman he married refused to die. Margaret returned to her life, but it would never be the same. She sold the house, donated most of the insurance money to women's shelters and legal aid organizations, and kept only enough to live comfortably in a small home near her sister's family. She didn't isolate herself, nor did she pretend everything was fine. She told her story to groups of women who had experienced domestic abuse, and her message was always the same. You don't need to fight back with violence. You fight with truth, and you document everything. Over time, her story became a kind of legend, an example of how awareness and planning could save a life when the law wasn't fast enough. She wasn't interested in fame. She turned down TV interviews and refused to write a book. For her, surviving was enough. Everything else was unnecessary noise, but one thing did stay with her. Late at night, in the quiet of her new home, she would sometimes feel that same tension in her chest, the same feeling from the weeks when she knew she was being hunted by someone she had once trusted. She kept the cameras installed even in her new place. Not because she feared Douglas, he was locked away, but because part of her would never again assume safety was guaranteed. Years passed. Margaret aged, but her clarity never dimmed. She remained sharp, cautious, and deeply private. She lived each day with a quiet kind of pride, not for having survived, but for refusing to let evil go unnoticed. Her survival wasn't the end of the story. It was a warning to others. The most dangerous people aren't always strangers in the dark. Sometimes they're sitting beside you at dinner, pouring your wine, waiting patiently for you to stop asking questions. In the end, Douglas thought he was the predator, but Margaret had never been prey. She had been the mirror, reflecting his own intentions back at him, documenting every step, turning each of his traps into evidence. And when the moment came, she didn't scream. She didn't run. She handed him the consequences with both hands and walked away. Margaret sitting alone on a porch, wearing a sweater, looking thoughtful, holding a warm mug. Grainy image, suburban street blurred in the background, sunny day, old phone effect. Douglas smiling while making breakfast in a small kitchen, overhead light on, grainy texture, blurry suburban street barely visible through kitchen window, sunny daylight outside. hidden security camera peeking out from behind. Books on a shelf. Dim interior. Dust particles in air. Suburban street visible through curtained window. Grainy image like from old phone. Margaret standing in front of a mailbox, holding a large manila envelope, looking over her shoulder. Suburban street in the background with parked cars, harsh sunlight, grainy old phone effect.